Well, good morning, everyone. We're at 9:30, so we'll resume the hearings. Just for anybody, any unfamiliar faces, I'm not sure there are many, but I'm Paul Griffiths, my colleague Simon Barclay. The first thing I'm going to do is go over to the council to do the usual housekeeping matters. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. Just a few housekeeping notes. Most of you have been here before, so it'll be old ground, but there are a few new faces, I think. First of all, when you arrived, if you signed in at the desk at the front, if you haven't already done that, just during the break, if you can sign in so we've got a record of who's here. There are no scheduled fire alarms to go off today, so if the alarm does go off, it is an emergency. If that happens, go through the main entrance and congregate at the corner of Gillygate and Claremont Terrace, just by the traffic lights. Door security, there are other users in the building today, as there are most days. But if you do see anybody you don't recognise and you don't think should be in the building, please alert staff and we'll sort it. Toilets are just through the corridor behind where Carol's standing. Water is obviously on the tables, and for anybody who's a member of the public, there's water on the tables at the front as well. Refreshments at lunchtime, there's plenty of cafes in Gillygate, so you can get a coffee or a sandwich or whatever in Gillygate. We are recording sessions today and filming them. If you have an issue with that, please speak to Carol as soon as possible, and she can relocate you to a table where the camera won't be pointing at you. There are forms on the front desks for people to see what we do with the recordings and just to get people's agreements that we are recording the sessions. Please keep your mobile phones turned on silent today. Also, in terms of the speaking and microphones, if you want to speak, put your name card on its end and get the attention inspectors, and they will indicate to you. Press the red button to turn the microphone on, and then when you finish speaking, turn it off with the red button again. In terms of the internet, the connection is very good. If you want to log on as Citadel Guest, and the password, it's all one word. It's General Booth 1883 with a capital G and a capital B. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. That's helpful. Today, it's the subject matter is matter 5, housing land supply. We set out a series of questions, 5.1 to 5.12, if I've got the right version of the document, unlike yesterday. Oops, but there we are. I think this, what we've been doing is grouping questions and dealing with them in that way, but I think our options today might be a little more limited. So I'm going to go through the questions in turn, but I accept there's going to be some crossover in certain areas. So I think we can be flexible. Something else I need to touch on. Yesterday, added up to the examination website, we had from the council a housing land supply update of May 22 and a windfall update technical paper. I've been able to read those in advance of the session today. I hope everyone else has. But I would say, I understand why they came in the day before, but I understand if people want to ask questions about them, make views known about them, then let us know. It may well be that at some stage we can open these out to further consultation if that's felt to be necessary when we consult on main mods, for example. It's possible. There's nothing else in particular I want to cover. But we'll deal with question 5.1 first. But Mr. Elvin, if there's anything also you want to say about the papers that came in yesterday, then you're welcome to.
Only that seemed to be echoing today. We produced these in advance of when we expected them because 5.7.1 of our hearing statement anticipated we'd have the new figures by the summer, and we're not quite in the summer yet, although yesterday was quite warm. So it's a little in advance of what we'd expected. The figures came in at the end of March, and we've tried to compile them as efficiently as possible. By and large, the trajectory reflects discussions with site owners and developers with regard to build-out rates. As I made clear to Ms Cook regarding ST15, the figures that we put in there are subject to further discussion with them because we haven't yet signed a statement of common ground with them, and therefore it may well be that in due course they can improve on the delivery rates or the delivery timing within ST15, but this is our current estimate, so that one doesn't reflect discussions with ST15, just so you're aware of that. Other than that, I will pass over to Laura Bartle just to answer the first main question, please.
Thank you. Good morning. So, policy SS1, in the view of the Council, expresses the annual housing requirement for the planned period. That figure, as it was submitted, will of course need modification to reflect the discussions earlier in the week and the revised housing requirement of 732 dwellings per annum. It's also worth noting that as part of the proposed modifications presented in April 21, that's EXCYC 58, that schedule addressed a revision to this particular part of the policy, introducing with it some reference to the minimum number of homes to be provided over the planned period of 16 years. So that modification will also need to be updated to reflect the 732 dwellings per annum, which will take the overall minimum plan requirement to 11,712. I should just point you to another part of that schedule of modifications in PM 55, which would introduce some new explanatory text to the policy SS1 and included a table identifying the sources of housing supply that were anticipated throughout the plan period. We recommend that that's also updated to reflect the current position and figures in line with what we published yesterday at EXCYC 76. In that particular document presented yesterday, I'd like to also point to an error under section 1 where it refers to the total supply of a minimum of 17,256 dwellings during the remaining 11 years of the plan period. It should in fact be the plan period itself. So apologies for that.
Where exactly is that? Is that in?
So in the document that was presented yesterday, under section 1, following the bullet points which set out the breakdown of supply, it incorrectly refers to the 17,256 dwellings being the remaining of the plan period of 11 years, but in fact it's actually the plan period as a whole. So just a note on that one.
If it read during the plan period, that would be the proper correction.
Of course, yes, yeah. Which we would update as part of that modification as, yeah. So in the context of those modifications that I've just referred to, the Council considers that Policy SS1 is appropriate in setting the overarching framework for delivering the growth required across the city. And with it, there's a suite of policies that stem directly from that policy. In the case of housing delivery specifically, Policy H1 is the most relevant, and it allocates specific sites for residential development, details of which we look forward to discussing at phase 3 of these hearings. Thank you.
Can I just take you to this? Just so we're aware of it, the housing supply note 76 replaces the figures that are in the hearing statement, which you've already said in relation to the bullet points. And so when you get to table 5 on the land supply calculations, you substitute the table under section 2 of the note.
Who would like to start us off on this first question? Mr. Coursier, then, off you go. Thank you.
So I was hoping somebody else would start off on these matters. I think what I'm going to say has been pretty well trawled over yesterday, but just to make the points. So we don't consider the policy SS1 does provide an adequate policy framework. Specifically, in our matters statement, we draw attention to the fact that the plan, I should have said the plan as a whole doesn't provide an adequate, and so neither does policy SS1. So just taking up Mr. Cook's point from yesterday, there is no policy in this plan, unlike most plans, dealing with windfall sites. How are unallocated sites to be dealt with when they come in as planning applications? We think that's a major deficiency. So it's a major deficiency for the fairly obvious reason that you need criteria. And I'll give you one example, sir, another matter which we dealt with yesterday. How do you deal with, for example, a large brownfield site coming forward in a small village? This is where the adequacy of a settlement hierarchy will give major problems. And so, of course, that brownfield sites can come forward on greenbelt sites under the greenbelt policy. And that would give, there are obviously major sustainability issues there which the council would have to grapple with without any policy framework. And so the other point we would, and this is a point I think we've emphasised throughout these hearings, is obviously policy SS1 seeks to prioritise making the best use of previously developed land. So there is no phasing in this plan which achieves this, and I would ask through you how the council thinks it's going to achieve that spatial shaper, because there's no vehicle in the plan to do that. And so when we go on to the housing supply, we see significant surplus above the housing requirement, including the non-implementation rate. And that consists of greenfield land, which the council accept would otherwise be in the greenbelt. And so there's nothing which would hold that back, so that its need could be reviewed in a future plan, and secondly, so to ensure that the very many major regeneration sites in the urban area are brought forward. They will be effectively competing with those brownfield sites. And again, to take you back to matter 2, what we have here is a very generous housing requirement, which is well above demographic requirements, which is driven by a very generous employment requirement. And those two things are likely to lead, in our view, to diversion of demand away from brownfield sites. But I'll go back and say, how does the council intend that this spatial shaper of prioritising brownfield land should be implemented, or is taken forward by the plan? There is no vehicle mechanism to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coursier. I think I'll look for a response to that first before opening the question up again. Mr. Elvin, are you able to help with?
Yes, that's accepted, which is why it's removed in proposed modification 52 following the discussion in phase 1.
Sir,
It's PM 52. Sorry, can I respond first, please? PM 52. It's accepted there isn't a phasing policy.
So can I just come back, because can I check that point, because I obviously don't have a paper copy of it, but I thought the council had changed that spatial shaper, but was reading from the composite modifications, but I need to check that point.
What PM52 says, and what I've got in front of me, is that it will prioritise making the best use of previously developed land.
And that's what I thought I'd read out.
But the phasing requirement is removed.
So, but that goes back to my point. Sorry, I couldn't have made myself clear on this. We have a spatial shaper which seeks something, which is prioritisation, but there is no phasing in the plan which seeks to achieve that. That's my point, sir. And I agree there's no phasing, but there is a spatial shaper which would seem to indicate that there should be.
So the question would be, how is brownfield land to be prioritised over other forms of site, over greenfield?
Yes, sir, that is my question.
Mr. Elvin?
I think it's a recognition of the difficulty of actually enforcing it. You can seek to give priority, but actually doing it in practice, we don't have control over site ownership or site availability, or indeed the development plans of those seeking to build out. And there's no point imposing a policy which can't be effectively enforced. Clearly the council wants to give priority to that and has identified as much previously developed land as possible, but that is in the hands of those bringing the sites forward. There's no mechanism to force them to do so, or at least not short of compulsory purchase, and I don't really think that that's a runner in the context of the housing allocations, frankly.
I understand the point. Mr. Kusi, do you want to come back again?
Yes, sir. As you're fully aware from the local plan housing supply, there are some very major brownfield sites, such as York Central, British Sugar, etc., where there's clear intentions by the developer to bring them forward. In fact, wouldn't be allocations if the council hadn't established that fact. And so the basic point here is that those sites will be competing with the very large greenfield supply, which the council is not seeking to hold back, or the whole of that greenfield supply can come forward on day one after adoption. And so it's phasing which is lacking in this plan, particularly given that it's seeking to allocate to 2038, and as we'll show, probably another 5 years beyond that. And in those circumstances, there is a need for phasing, sir.
So far, oh, sorry, sir.
So just to come back to something you said there, Mr. Corsia, there will be competing, you say, with the greenfield sites. Why, in your view, is that a problem?
It's a problem, sir, if brownfield sites is national policy, sir, that brownfield sites should, I can't remember the word, I did actually look it up last night, but there is obviously the...
So I know what you mean.
I can't remember the exact wording, but it's obviously the MPPF makes a point that the best use should be made of brownfield land, and it would certainly not making the best use of that land, sir, if those sites should not come forward because the demand is diverted away from onto greenfield sites. And so I go back to this generosity of supply point, and I think you need to consider that within these terms. There is a significant surplus of greenfield land being allocated over and above requirements, sir. Not only in the plan period, but beyond the plan period. There is no mechanism in the plan to hold that greenfield land back to prioritise brownfield land, either in the early phase of the plan or indeed for the post-2033 period.
So do you say then, or do you think that that's what the MPPF means, that where you have a mixed supply in terms of brownfield and greenfield, that the brownfield sites should be coming forward first?
Not necessarily. I'm not saying that one should prevent any greenfield land coming forward before all the brownfield sites are developed. That certainly would not be consistent with national policy. But when you have a very large supply of greenfield land being brought forward to meet needs over a very long period, then it would be rational to hold back some of that greenfield supply to ensure that they are not developed before the brownfield sites.
If I were to agree with you, would the council be able to demonstrate a 5-year housing land supply? And if the answer to that is no, what do you think I should do about that? In effect, are you asking us to allocate more land?
I'm not asking you to allocate more land, sir, but you would obviously have to look at some of these sites, and particularly those ones which are unlikely to make any significant contribution in the 5-year supply. And, for example, ST15 now has been moved backwards in the trajectory, in terms of timing. You would have to look at the contribution these very large sites are going to not make it in reality much of a contribution to the 5-year supply. So
I'm already regretting mentioning 5-year supply this early in the day. If we can just hold back our excitement on the 5-year supply for now.
So can I just
Yes,
come back on that? Firstly, the NPPF doesn't require a priority to be ascribed. It's encouragement, as we all know. Secondly, there is no legitimate policy policy basis for rationing the way that housing comes forward. And as your question suggests, the difficulty would be if you placed an embargo, if that were feasible. And I've come across examples where it's been attempted and failed. That would have significant impacts on delivery and supply. And if you want a demonstration that York is prioritising its brownfield land, we've already granted planning permission to British Sugar for 1,000 houses. It's set out in Rapley's statement at section 1 in the introduction. So that priority is being given. Of course, it's acknowledged there are some major brownfield sites. That's why British Sugar is so important to the plan, and why it has, why its part in York Central has a policy of its own. So we are ascribing that policy in practice, that priority in practice, but there are no feasible means of rationing, and it would have adverse impacts on delivery within the plan generally.
Thank you, Mr. Elvin. I think the point I was itching to make, but I think Mr. Elvin has just made it, is that there is a priority on brownfields, on making the best use of land in the current version of the NPPF, but I don't think that's in the 2012 version, is it?
Desperately, I did look it up last night, and I've been desperately looking for my copy, my paper copy of it. I cannot be able to find it. I was just looking it up when you said there is I'm sure there is, and if you give me 5 minutes, I'll come back to that point.
If you can unearth it, a reference to it, that would be useful.
I know brownfield land is referred to, and I'm sure it refers to best use, but I need to look it up and to give you a reference. I apologise for not having that in front of me.
Please don't. It's just that if there is a reference to something, I'd like to see it.
Yeah, the provision I had in mind was paragraph 17. The 7th bullet encouraged the effective use of land by reusing land that has been previously developed, providing it's not of high environmental value. And Mr. Henderson is whispering para 111 in my ear as well, which I'm sure you're right.
I suspect it's paragraph 111 that Mr. Corsier had in mind.
Was certainly the paragraph I remember looking up last night.
That's helpful, thank you.
Yes, sir.
111.
If I could just read it to you. Planning policy and decisions should encourage effective use of land by reusing land that has been previously developed brownfield land, provided it's not of high environmental quality. And it goes on to say local planning authorities may continue to consider the case for setting a locally appropriate target for the use of brownfield land.
Great, thank you. Yes, gentleman over there. Mr. Johnson, I've brought my glasses today.
Yes, Mark Johnson from Johnson Mowat. Just on the point of what happens if you prioritise brownfield land, I'll take you to the paper that's just been issued this morning, on page 3, where we can see the delivery rates for 2017 to 2022. So what you don't need is, it's very echoey this one, I'm going to move it further back.
So was this the housing and supply update?
Yes, sir, it is. The one that was on the table this morning but was issued last night. But what you don't necessarily need for brownfield land, whether it's in a village or on a major developed site in the Green Belt, is that you don't necessarily need an allocation. Brownfield sites of what this council has been relying upon for the last 56 years whilst it's had no plan, because everything else has been largely constrained by the Green Belt. And what the prioritising of brownfield land demonstrates is that the delivery rates for the last 5 years, which include quite a high level of student provision, actually get you to a shortfall position of minus 343 dwellings. And the reason why we need the allocations is actually to stop the rot. So there is a continued flow of brownfield sites within the supply, and the reason why we don't need phasing is that if you put a phasing mechanism now, is that you're not actually going to boost the supply of housing. The phasing mechanism that's actually built into this plan actually comes quite naturally in the form of small sites, greenfield sites, and large greenfield sites. The large greenfield sites you'll see from the revised trajectory, which has to be welcomed because there is a lot of good work that's been done behind the scenes with the council over the last few weeks, is that the large sites, the strategic sites, have got high levels of upfront infrastructure, and they naturally phase themselves as being slower in the delivery mechanism because they come on stream later. What you'll see is a flurry of smaller greenfield sites in the first instance to boost the supply. And therefore, on that basis, you actually don't need a phasing mechanism. And certainly to suggest that you prioritise brownfield above greenfield will be a disaster for land supply, because we can see what's been happening in the last 10 years at least is that you never achieve your housing requirement.
Thank you. I don't know, Mr. Owen, if there was anything in that you wanted to come back on.
No, it's a slightly more apocalyptic version of what I said earlier.
Mr. Keogh.
Thank you, sir. Just to echo what Mr. Johnson has said, and just to add a few more points of information. So there's been no restrictions or impediments to brownfield sites coming forward in the city over the past 20 years. There have been significant brownfield sites delivered, going back to the early 2000s, the Tenneco site, the Donnelly's Printworks site. I think that together they delivered about 800 houses. The Terry site, which I've been involved in for the past 13 years, that's come forward, delivered over 700 units. The Nestlé site is currently on site at the moment on Nestlé, and permission has been granted for the remainder of the Nestlé South site. York Gasworks, York Central, the British Sugar site, so the list goes on and on and on of brownfield sites that have come forward. There is no need, as Mr. Johnson has explained the reasons why, for phasing. And there's certainly no oversupply, as we argue, as Mr. Corsi would say, in fact, quite the opposite. One of the problems with many of the brownfield sites, sir, is that, as I think we are all aware, apart from the high infrastructure costs and high remediation costs of some of these sites, the consequences, of course, is that they don't deliver significant amount of affordable housing. And the council has made clear in its affordable housing note, which I think is EXCYC 36 from memory, that greenfield sites are the main source of affordable housing delivery over the planned period. So far from holding back greenfields, and also, sir, in the period that, in the last 20 years, the few greenfield sites that have come forward, I'm thinking particularly of Germany, Beck and Derwentthorpe, they haven't been held back by the fact that brownfield sites have been developed in the city, and both, what's happened is both have developed together. Greenfield sites and brownfield sites have been developed along side by side, catering for different aspects of the market. Again, one of the characteristics of particularly the latest batch of brownfield sites, of course, is that they're predominantly apartments and not delivering any significant family housing. So for those reasons, I think there's simply no need for the phasing of brownfield land, as Mr. Corsier suggested, and there's certainly no danger of oversupply by the allocation of the greenfield sites in the local plan. In fact, as you're well aware from our representation, quite the opposite. We feel there's a need for an increase in supply to meet housing needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keogh. Mr. Garland?
Thank you, sir. Well read from that distance. Just going back to the question 5.1, and I just wanted to put my view across in relation to the implications of last Thursday's discussion on housing requirement and how that fits into an answer to this point. You were left with a decision to make, really, between two approaches to defining the housing requirement. The one put forward by ourselves, which was similar to the standard method figure and similar to the figure that officers at the council recommended to members originally, around just above 1,000, before adopting the 822 annual figure. And the version that the council was defending on Thursday, which is that lower figure. Obviously, in terms of the framework, the policy framework of the plan, if you opt for the latter, there is some difficulty in agreeing that the framework is suitable for the delivery of housing. But there was a further discussion on Thursday around the lower council's figure and the potential for that to be revisited by the council themselves related to the unambitious jobs target per annum. And you asked a question of the council in relation to what the implications of that might be for the plan. And my memory serves me correctly, the answer to that was that the council would revisit the allocations that they had in the plan and essentially, I paraphrase, squeeze more in. And if that wasn't to be achieved, if there was an answer to your question that resulted in the need to allocate more land, that would attract an objection from Historic England, which seemed to me to be something that the council was seeking to avoid at all costs by answering in the way they did. It seems to me that the council can't possibly know, because we don't know what the figure would be if a more ambitious jobs target was alighted on and applied to a housing requirement. The council simply doesn't know how much housing would need to be squeezed in to the existing allocations, and whether A, that would make them acceptable in terms of placemaking, or even in their own right, those changes to those allocations would result in a form of development that themselves would be unacceptable to Historic England, and a better alternative might be the allocation of land elsewhere, which may not attract that discussion. The council simply doesn't know the answer to that question.
If I may, I think I probably should have made it clear at the outset, but I think we need to have this discussion today on the basis that the 822 figure that we talked about the other day is accepted We have to have, because I think if we start to open up, well, will there be, if the requirement is higher, have we got a 5-year housing land supply, or if it's lower, will we? I don't think we can have that. We have to assume that 822 is correct for the purposes of the hearing today. But if we go away and think that it's not correct and the figure should be higher or perhaps lower, then I think we're going to have this conversation again once that figure has been arrived at, or once our thoughts are made plain. So what happens today, I think, has to be relatively constrained.
Thank you, sir. I do accept that, which is why I highlighted on the second part of my point on the 822 figure. But it was clearly implied on Thursday that would change.
Mr. Elvin?
It was a hypothetical question. You asked us what, in the event that you reached a different conclusion. It's not saying it will change. It was saying how we would likely proceed if you recommended a change. That's a different point.
Yeah, that was my recollection. Does that help?
I'm fine with that answer, sir.
Good. Thank you. Councillor Pavlovich?
Thank you, sir. On page 3 of the new papers that we've received this morning, I'd like some clarity on the 539 dwellings in communal establishments and student accommodation, which is a reduction from 720 on the previous documents, which we felt was an underestimation of the reality of the situation as we see it today. Excuse me, sir. Since 2020, we've had consents already granted for over 1,000 units of student accommodation. And I'm just wondering how they've come to that overall figure. And if you look at the 5-year housing land supply, the net completions in 2017-18 of 1,331 actually included 637 student units. And of course, the consequence of that is that there's no Section 106 affordable housing number. And I make no apologies for beating the same drum that I did on Thursday about the insufficient amount of affordable housing, which is not going to meet the needs of a vibrant, thriving economy.
Thank you.
The short answer is that is simply a result of moving the date of the assessment forward a year, as all the other figures have gone down as well for the same reason. So there's an add-on for the latest year, but because you add on, one drops off as well at the other end. That's my understanding. Go on.
Thank you, sir. But the 720 over the overall period of the plan still strikes us as being a gross underestimate of what we're actually seeing on the ground.
So do you say that 539 figure should be higher? Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, reality suggests it should be higher because that's what we're seeing coming through planning.
I'll ask for a short response, please. Thank you. Mr. Boyd will deal with that.
Hi, so I think what's happened is the 539 has had a multiplier applied to it, so the figure should be a bit higher than that, but because we're converting that into households, there'll be a multiplier. So the figure could well be higher than 539.
In terms of bed spaces.
In terms of bed spaces. I think we can probably just check what that multiplier is and come back to you.
Did you just say bed spaces?
In terms of bed spaces, yes. So, for example, there could be over 1,000 bed spaces, but converting that into dwellings, you'll have to apply a multiplier to get to that figure for the sake of, relying on it for 5-year land supply. Yeah.
It might be a block of student accommodation.
But we can't, we can't rely on that one for one in terms of units, if that makes sense.
Because it's a student room, not a dwelling. Yeah, understood. Councillor Pavlovich?
Need to check that. I'm just saying that.
No, I acknowledge that it's not a one-for-one. It's not on a basis of one-for-one. But even if it was a percentage, what that's doing is that's actually skewing from the general housing needs and being counted towards the overall housing completions. And that's our worry, that what we're not seeing is therefore the percentage of genuinely affordable housing being delivered. Because the university is expanding, it's expanding within the brownfield, and that's what we're seeing in practice. So we're not seeing housing for families, we're not seeing housing for individuals, and we're not seeing affordable housing coming through. We're seeing purpose-built student accommodation being counted towards the overall housing completion. And I know the NPPF allows that to happen, but it does skew the figures.
I understand, but is there anything policy SS1 as amended could do about that? Is there anything you suggest?
Well, that's why we felt that there should have been a higher figure, and that was discussed at length on Thursday.
Understood. That's helpful.
That's Mr. Boyd to come in.
Please.
I think I would just make the point that, as we know, when we deliver student accommodation, that is ultimately freeing up family housing. So that is the point, I guess. So rather than 6 students taking up a house in multiple occupation, and a Victorian family house, by providing purpose-built student accommodation, we're effectively freeing up that family housing to other households. So that's the point of that, really.
Sir, if I could just come back on that. That's why we have an Article 4, and the bulk of the city, in fact the whole city, is covered by the Article 4 with thresholds. So we can't see, particularly in the areas around the universities, an expansion of existing family homes being converted to HMOs, because they're already at threshold and way in excess of threshold in most places.
Well, I understand the point you make, but I don't want to get diverted too far down that road. That's for a future hearing, I think, when we'll have to talk about that.
The other thing to bear in mind is the Article 4, I think, prevents conversion to HMOs, and what Mr. Boyd's talking about is the freeing up of houses in multiple occupation to provide family dwellings. So it's the opposite, yeah.
That's helpful. Mr. Johnson? We're still, by the way, on the first question.
We are, sir, and I can't help but thinking that student housing, in terms of its housing number, requires its own separate conversation. But just on that point, just on the numbers, because I can see the council have referenced 539 in communal establishments, but from the supply data provided today, it looks as if it's 539 from 22 onwards in the supply, and even then, we think there's another one of those consented developments which is actually student, and I'll let Mr. Keogh come back to that one. But if I'm right, from the way I've totted these up, there's 539 in the forward supply, and what the 17,256 dwellings is meant to represent is from 2017 onwards. So what we've not done is we've not looked back over the last 5 years to see how many we've had from communal establishments. And there is also, within that student numbers discussion, is how the council has calculated the number of dwellings. And without getting too techie on this, it's if you get 1,000 student rooms, does that represent 500 dwellings, or does it represent 200 dwellings? Because in effect, it depends on how many bedrooms you've got in each of the individual clusters that surround the communal areas, such as the kitchen and the dining area. And it looks in some of the cases here as if that ratio seems a little bit on the low side. So first of all, from this very short note, is I don't think the figure of 539 is right. I think that's looking forward from 2022, and therefore we need to understand what it's been looking back to 2017. The communal ratios, I'm not convinced, and I don't think that all of the ones are fully captured. Now, where that then becomes important, and I know we've mentioned this before, is there an over-provision of the student numbers eating what should be into the family housing requirement and supply argument? And I don't think we've had from the council as to at what point it becomes too many or too few.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I think we better deal with that before I open the conversation up further.
Firstly, I'd already answered the point which Mr. Johnson made, which is the 539 is from 2022. The figures have been brought forward a year from those set out in the earlier hearing statement.
Shall I just come back on the student numbers and how that's calculated? Yeah, we're conscious that this is a point that's been raised throughout a number of the representations. And just to provide some clarity on the council's approach to student accommodation and how it calculates those figures, notwithstanding what Mr. Johnson may want to come back on. I think it's fair to say that the council's kind of had a long history of monitoring student accommodation and communal accommodation. The justification for that's provided, firstly, Annex 3 of the 2018 SLAR, which is ST049B. And that takes you through the council's approach generally. It provides reference to the definition of general housing provided by, at the time, DCLG, and what that means in terms of general housing including purpose-built homes, which gives an example of self-contained clustered flats that should be included, and each self-contained unit should be counted as a dwelling. And that's the basis that the council has moved forward with. It also recognised in the MPPG that allowance should be given for student housing in council's calculation of housing supply. That's at paragraph 38, which states that all student accommodation, whether that's communal halls or communal halls of residence or self-contained dwellings, whether on campus or off campus, should be included towards the housing requirement and based on the amount of accommodation it releases in the housing market, which is the point that Mr. Boyd just made, and that local authorities should take account reasonable steps to avoid double counting, which is what the council has done. The SLAR, the 2018 SLAR, also provides an example of how the council calculates the conversion of bed spaces into dwellings, which it counts towards its completion rates. It's worth noting that the updated PPG, and no, we're not dealing with that under the transitional arrangements, but it does extend the earlier version of the PPG to provide some clarity on how that calculation is taken forward, and refers to the ratios based on census data. That ratio for student accommodation is 2.5, and that's actually specified in the housing delivery test rulebook, on the basis of which the inclusion of student accommodation forms part and parcel of the net additional dwellings, which feeds into the calculation of the housing delivery test. So the council applies that ratio to on-campus halls of residence that's built. That's a strict application of that ratio. For off-campus purpose-built accommodation, it takes that cluster-based approach, which I referred to in the DCLG definition. And in that sense, it looks on an individual basis at the scheme and the floor plans to make an assessment of cluster accommodation in effect. So where you've got bedrooms sharing communal facilities, that would be counted as one self-contained unit. So you may have 10 bed spaces across 2 floors, each of which have communal accommodation, and that would be counted as 2 additional dwellings. So it's a hybrid approach that is taken, and importantly, on an annual basis, that methodology and the application of those ratios or the assessment of clusters is reported in the housing monitoring updates, which are reported annually. So the council has a consistent record of how those figures have been arrived at.
Thank you. I'm anxious to move on, but Mr. Lane.
Thank you, sir. Not entirely sure, as we seem to have jumped around the shop a bit here this morning, where we are in the agenda.
I'm still on the first question, but we have jumped around a little bit, and hopefully we'll reap the benefits later in the day, but
hopefully, sir.
Not too much later.
My point, quite simple, really. Yesterday we heard quite extensively from Mr. Keown about the lack of flexibility built into this plan. And I think that's obvious from the council's table in their addendum that was published yesterday. If you look to the 5-year housing land supply figures towards the end of the plan, it shows that in the last 2 years, they're projecting they won't be able to achieve their 5-year housing land supply. That's row P, I think, sir. And that has implications, particularly concerning the green belt and the need to be a permanent green belt. The council are thereby recognising that at the end of the plan period to 32-33, they won't have a 5-year housing land supply, and it can't be right, sir, to define a permanent green belt. That will have to be reviewed within the plan period to achieve that 5-year housing land supply. Simple point. The other point that was made yesterday, that this council doesn't have any white land or safeguarded land. They have no reserves to draw upon, so that has implications. So that we go to our point to say that the council need to identify further and additional sites to make sure that they have enough flexibility to ensure that there is a 5-year housing land supply at all times. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall I take a few more submissions? Mr. Alsbury, go on.
Morning, sir. Thank you. Craig Alsbury of Avis & Young on behalf of Defence Infrastructure Organisation. I have made submissions about the student housing point in our matter statement, and so in order just to close that off, if I may, I'm going to deal with it really briefly. And the student housing point is important because when you look at past completions and the forward supply, the local authority is factoring 977 homes into its housing land supply calculation on the back of student housing delivery or communal accommodation delivery. So it's a significant component of the 5-year land supply calculation. You were taken a few minutes ago to the PPG, and of course that's relevant, it's important to have regard to it, but you weren't, in fairness, read the quote faithfully. What the MPPG says is that all student accommodation, whether it consists of communal halls of residence, self-contained dwellings, and whether or not it's on campus, can in principle count towards contributing to an authority's housing land supply based on the amount of accommodation that new student housing releases in the wider housing market, and then it says in brackets, by allowing existing properties to return to general residential use, or the extent to which it allows general market housing to remain in such use rather than being converted to student accommodation. And the officer from the council has helpfully explained the methodology that the council has applied in this instance and has referenced the 2.5 ratio from the housing delivery test, which I understand. But what's missing, it seems to me, is any real evidence that the delivery of student accommodation is actually releasing homes back into the market. So it's using a national census data figure of 2.5, not a locally derived figure, and nor is it calling on any local evidence of student accommodation releasing effectively family homes back into the market. So we say the inclusion of 977 homes in the housing land supply calculation is not sound. And so you'll see, sir, when you look at the calculations that we've included in our matters statement, we've provided two sets of figures. We've provided a calculation with the student accommodation built into it as per the council's approach, but we've also provided an alternative with the student housing taken out. Thank you.
I'm sorry to be a bit slow, but can you show me exactly where you're getting that 977 from?
Yeah, so looking at the trajectory that was issued by the local authority yesterday afternoon.
Okay.
And I think I'm reading it correctly. I've had to use my own version sort of blown up because the one in the pack is very, very small indeed. But I think what I'm seeing is past completions. So this is, if you look at the trajectory document, sir, which is this thing, and ignore the headings for a minute, the second line down, in the total column there, you've got, for 2017, 18, 35 completions, then 2, then 67, then 82, then 252. Yeah, so that's completions to date. And then if you scroll down, section 5, projected housing completions from communal establishments and student accommodation. Looking forward, you've got 385, 26 and 128, which is the 539 that was referenced earlier by Mr. Johnson. Add those two together, it's 977.
I understand. Brilliant. Thank you.
Well, can I come back to my point? That the 539 is taking it forward from April this year. So the 539 is a forward-looking, a supply figure, not a completions figure. Secondly, I think Mr. Alsbury is reading from the latest version of the PPG. And while we're using the ratio for on-campus student accommodation, we're not using it for the off-campus accommodation, as we explained earlier.
Do you want to come back on that then?
Yeah, may I? I don't think the council can have its cake and eat it. I mean, on the one hand, it's saying it's using a ratio of 2.5, which derives from a 2018 document, the Housing Delivery Test Toolkit. But now it's saying that we can't have regard to the expanded version of the narrative in the PPG, which obviously postdates that. So either we go back to the original version of PPG, 2014, whatever it was, and we don't have a figure of 2.5 to work with, and so the council still has to demonstrate that it's got evidence to support the inclusion of student accommodation in its trajectory, or actually we just take a sensible approach and look at the ratio which it's applied, but then it has to demonstrate the ratio is applicable in York.
I understand.
Yeah, well, it's Mr. Alsbury who's being illogical, because if we go back to the 2014 guidance, which is what applies, we have a much wider discretion because there's no national ratio applied. We've sought to restrict that simply by looking at that, but we're adopting the general approach in 2014. And as we explained earlier, this is based, the off-campus accommodation is looked at and reported in the annual monitoring report, so it's not just assumed.
I think, well, we'll move it along. Mr. Keogh.
Thank you, sir. A number of points. Firstly, going back to the point that Councillor Pavlovich raised about the completions, the very high number of completions in 2017-18. So I've reproduced the affordable housing completion data from the Council's affordable housing note in Table 4 of my 5-year supply note that I submitted yesterday. And so in Table 4, you'll see that net housing completions, including student units, which, as Councillor Pavlovich mentioned, were over 600 units that year. So 2017-18, net housing completions, 1296. All affordable housing completions resulting from planning consent, 45. So it just demonstrates the impact that student completion is having on skewing the data when it comes to between what is delivering and not delivering affordable housing. So you'll see also, we might come back to this, but also if you go across the rest of that line on my Table 4, you'll see that because of the right to buy in 2017-18, there was actually a net loss of social housing units in the city. So I'd like to go on to the point raised by Mr. Boyd that student accommodation is freeing up housing, general market housing in the city. Sir, there is absolutely no evidence to demonstrate that point. In fact, sir, I have raised this point going back to my 2018 representations, and I have not seen any evidence produced by the council to demonstrate or support that point. As Mr. Aylesbury has just pointed out, sir, and I've pointed out in my representations, the planning policy guidance note is clear that the use of student housing in the housing supply data should be based on the accommodation, the amount of accommodation it releases to the housing market. So it's not just me who's been asking this question. Several planning committees, councillors have asked this question, and I've not been given an answer on that point. So to demonstrate what's happening in the city, the new student accommodation that's been built on and off campus is simply soaking up the increase in student numbers in the city in recent years. I would refer you, sir, to our evidence presented by Mrs. O'Neill on Matter 3, Economic Development, which had appended to it a study by Nickel Economic, a note on the role of the University of York in the economy of York. So that's, again, that's Mrs. O'Neill's submission on Matter 3, Economic Development, on behalf of the University of York. And Mr. Nickel's note, page 5, has a table in there, Table 2, which illustrates the increase both in staff and student numbers in the University of York since 2016-17. So in 2016-17, 16,545 full-time equivalent students. 21-22, there are 21,250 full-time equivalent students. That's a change of 4,705 students over that period, an increase of 28%. At the same time, sir, I understand, I don't have the figures to hand, but the student numbers in other colleges have more than likely been increasing as well. As I mentioned in earlier sessions, the city has 4 major higher education institutions: the University of York, York St John University, York College and Askham Bryan College. And as you can imagine, sir, they generate a huge demand for accommodation. And that is where all of the student accommodation that has been built in recent years has gone. It's simply soaking up the increase in numbers. I have asked in my representations down the years for the council to demonstrate how many houses have been released back into the market as a result of student accommodation being built? And I have not got, and no one else has got an answer to that question, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Keogh.
Thank you, sir.
Shall we deal with that point, Mr. Alvin? Is there anything in there you wanted to come back on?
I don't think I've got anything to add to what I've said earlier.
I think we can just add to what we have already said. One point, which, and it's not a surprising point, but given the presence of the Article 4 and the increase in purpose-built student accommodation, we have seen a downward trend of HMO approvals over the past 10 years, which would help to support the fact that those houses have remained in as family accommodation and not been turned over to student accommodation.
Sorry, I think just to add to that as well, just in terms of Mr. Keogh's table 4, when he references the figure of 45, I think it's important just to recognise that we're talking about the provision of purpose-built student accommodation to release existing stock to avoid losing out existing stock. So we're not going to see those figures picked up in that table in terms of 45. We're not going to see new build completions figures inflated there because we're effectively releasing existing stock back into the market. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I've got the point. Thank you. Is there anything else on this first question? I think we're going a little off piece. Councillor Pavlovich, is that your nameplate? Let's just deal with this quickly because I'd like to move on, I think.
It was, but I was just going to challenge the assumption about declining numbers of HMOs. But if you'd rather move on, we'll move on. I
think we probably best deal with that at a future hearing because I understand that it's a contentious issue, but I don't really want to deal with it here when we're talking about housing land supply. Thank you. Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, without returning to the matter, sir, if that table of the supply is going into SS1, I just wonder whether or not the council would be prepared to clarify it, because all of the figures, apart from the student numbers, are for the whole of the plan from 2017. And I do think, with respect to that list of numbers, is that what it ought to say then, to be more accurate, is that if you look at the 4th bullet point down, the 3767 includes student provision, 2017 to 21, and that the 5th bullet point, the 539, is student provision from 2022 onwards. And I think that will be more fair and reflective of the discussion that we've just had.
Please.
Sorry, just to come back on that, I fully accept the point. The way that particular paragraph was structured was in direct response to update says your own calculations that you provided back to us in the MIQs. So we weren't necessarily proposing to substitute that into the plan directly. It was just an update to the calculations that you'd kindly provided to us. We would indeed report it separately and identify it separately as part of the plan modifications.
Okay, well, let's be sure we pick that up. That's helpful. Thank you. I'm going to move the conversation on to the second question. What we set out there was linked to the latest housing trajectory update when these MIQs were put together. Now, this, and we might be able to deal with this quite quickly, this sets out the understanding at the time. My understanding is that is reflected in or updated in the document that you put in yesterday, as long as I'm clear about that. Does anyone want to have anything to say about 5.2? Mr. Alsbury, go on.
Thank you, sir. really quick minor point. We have looked at the capacities of the H and ST sites as part of our kind of analysis and reworking of the housing trajectory. And you will have seen in our matter statement at 1.2, we identify in sub-point A to F a number of minor discrepancies. So, for example, where against site H5 the local authority has a capacity of 165, we think the planning permission in place there is for 159. So we've been down the list. The council in its latest housing land supply update and revised trajectory appears to have picked up on, I think, 3 of the anomalies, but there are 3 remaining, we think. And they're tiny in the grand scheme of things, in terms of numbers, but that's not really the point. The reason why I'm making the point is because we've derived this information from what we believe is the most up-to-date planning history information online. If we've got that wrong, then there might be other bits that we've not seen or we've got wrong after interrogating the online system. So I just flag that. We don't really need to look at the sites because the figures are so inconsequential, but I just ask the council to look at our submissions in our Matter 5 statement and just double check those numbers.
Okay, I'm sure I can leave that with the council, can I?
Of course, yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Mr. Keogh.
Sorry, so just one small point before we move on, just to complete the discussion on student numbers. Just to go back to a point Mr. Johnson raised, he said there were other student schemes included in the numbers, but we're not sure whether the ratio has been applied to them. So I think he was referring to, and I identified it as well, on page 11 of the council's update note issued yesterday. Halfway down the page, you've got major development sites with consent, site capacity 10 or greater homes. If you can turn it up. Yep. So towards the end of that table, you've got Plum Base, Waterloo House, Fawcett Street. So my understanding is that's a student scheme. And further down, Frederick House, Fulford Road, 232 units. Again, so my understanding is that's a student scheme. I just raise it because obviously they're quite significant numbers in that table.
Is that something that the council can respond to immediately, or is it something you'll have to have a look at?
Yeah, we'll confirm separately if that's okay. But they are off-campus accommodations, so as I expressed earlier, we look at that on an individual basis, and we include it as part of the overall dwelling stock. It's not separated out into the communal establishments, so that's the significant difference there. So everything that's identified in tables is referred to as communal or student accommodation. That's where the ratio is applied. Where it isn't applied, and we take a site-by-site basis approach, that's included within the overall net dwelling stock. Appreciate that that's not perhaps easy to reconcile, but we can, if it would be helpful, make it clear which of those sites do relate to student accommodation, and also identify the basis on which the figure, the net additional dwelling figure, has been calculated.
I think that would be helpful, because what I'm surmising from what Mr. Keogh says is that perhaps those numbers need to have a ratio applied. Is that the point you're making?
Yes, so that's the point I'm making. We may come on to it later in the day in the discussion of housing supply generally, but and this applies not just to, and we're only talking about the student accommodation that's in this evidence in this table or this paper, sir. I've referred to in my representations the fact that pre-2017-18 there has been a significant number of student numbers included in units included in the completions data, off-campus units, which have obviously acted to reduce the backlog figure. And that's and I've made the point being, of course, that then in turn suppresses the requirement for land, for housing land.
Forgive me. Okay, we've heard quite a lot about student housing. We've heard a little bit about affordable housing as we've gone along as well. It is and has always been our intention to have specific sessions about those housing types. I think you mentioned the discussion that we'll have later on today about housing in general. Well, actually, that's what we're supposed to be talking about now. So I'm not going to hear anything